Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring things to order here. I see we still have a few people filing in, but we've got a pretty good number of folks in the audience. So why don't we go ahead and begin on time so we can end on time as well. So my name is Hal Brands. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's my pleasure to host our event today, which is a debate on whether the United States should embrace a grand strategy of restraint or not. This event is part of a larger speaker series, and it's the first event in this series for the year. This is the America and the World speaker series. And so over the course of this academic year, we will have a number of events looking at some of the big questions in America's role in the world pertaining to the 2020 election, US-China relations, the role of advanced technologies in American foreign policy, and a variety of other subjects. And we decided to kick things off with the debate on what is perhaps the biggest issue in American foreign policy today, which is the question of whether the United States should continue to lean forward, so to speak, in its role in the world, or whether it should perhaps pull back a bit and adopt a more restrained foreign policy. This event, I should also mention, is being sponsored as well by the Alexander Hamilton Society. There are not one but two chapters of AHS at Johns Hopkins. There's the one in Baltimore that's run by the undergrads, and then there is the one in the swampy hinterlands here in Washington, D.C., which is run by the master's students at SAIS, and I'm very pleased to be able to cooperate with them on this event, and I really thank them for all that they did to make it possible. So we have two terrific speakers here to help us work through these issues today, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they are going to speak. So first off, we have Barry Posen, who is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that Dr. Posen is one of the most eminent international relations scholars in the world. He really is one of the foremost voices for restraint in American foreign policy today, having written a book with that title, which was published in 2014, and having written a number of excellent articles in Foreign Affairs and other publications laying out the case for a more restrained foreign policy. So I'm delighted to have him here today, and his sparring partner will be Dr. Michael Mazzar of the Rand Corporation, who has written recently a book on the Iraq War, which has garnered quite a lot of attention and esteem. He is incredibly prolific and has written on a wide variety of subjects, from gray zone aggression to the North Korean nuclear program and everything in between. And so I'm delighted to have him here as well. The way this is going to work is that it is structured as a debate. And so we'll start with both Barry and Mike laying out their cases over about 15 minutes each. After that, I will engage them in some conversation. I'll throw a few questions and challenges at them and let them respond to that. But our hope is also that we'll get a good multilateral dialogue going involving the folks who are out here watching the event, who have joined us today. And so what I'll ask is that if you have questions, please enter them using the chat function, and then I will pose them to our panelists. And so that can help us combine questions if we need to and manage time, and is a little bit more compatible with the format. You can start entering the questions as soon as you like, and we will transition to that as soon as we have a critical mass of people who are looking to get into the game. So I look forward to all of this. I have gone on long enough, and so at this point, let me just say thank you to you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers for being here with us, and I will turn it over to you, Barry, who is still muted.
There we go. Sorry. Again, thanks for organizing this. It's great to see you all. I'm going to start with a little bit of humor here, which is I want to welcome Mike to the camp of restraint. I reviewed the policy prescriptions in the Washington Quarterly article. They seem pretty restrained to me. So he's kind of tiptoeing into the camp, and I hope that he'll cross the threshold pretty soon. It's not always true that you find someone who's willing to walk the walk but not talk the talk. Usually you have the reverse problem. So we're willing to take on all the support we can get. Like Ronald Reagan said about the Republican Party, restraint's a big tent. So it's great to be here with you. I'm going to speak a little bit from my book, Restraint. Book's been out for a long time, so many of you have probably seen at least bits and pieces of it, but it's hard to talk about this without going through the argument more or less in total. Unfortunately, this takes 40 minutes, and I'm not going to try and talk really, really fast to get it out. So some pieces of this I'm just going to abbreviate. We'll leave them there as bullet points. And then there's a few things I'm going to try and take a little more time with that are new, right? So yeah, that's the way I'm going to proceed here. So, with restraint, title tells all, or maybe not enough, people who subscribe to the strategy believe that the United States should do less, right? Now, I think I want to say something about grand strategy, right? One, grand strategy is the state's theory about how to cause security for itself. And I define security somewhat narrowly. To me, it's safety, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the power position necessary to comfortably defend these values. Others may define it more broadly, and I can't stop them. But what I can do is try and show that a narrowly construed grand strategy is possible to come up with, and that try to argue why it might serve the United States better. I should also say that a grand strategy is a conceptual framework. It's not a cookbook. It's not a list of commandments. It defines interests. It develops means, ends, chains to achieve those interests. It sets priorities. And it includes one or more explanations for these choices, right? So it's a conceptual framework, and people are using it to assess the world and try and come up with options as new problems arise, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the exact solution to every problem. So restraint basically argues we should do less, and I've been clear, I think we need to stop pursuing the expansive, undisciplined, and chronically martial grand strategy that I've called liberal hegemony, but I didn't invent the term. The term comes from John Eikenberry, and I think it pretty much captures, the essence of where the kind of the foreign policy establishment has been for the last 20 years. You could believe or disbelieve this, but looking again at the question in a humorous way, I did a quick Google search yesterday for US-led world order and came up with 14,000 or so hits yesterday. Probably they're not all pertinent. Washington is full of projects to talk about threats to the US-led liberal world order. I traced the emergence of this grand strategy out of debates that did happen in the 90s, but basically more or less were winding down in the late 90s and certainly wound down after 2001. So I think it's a reasonable description of what the grand strategy has been. And the strategy arises from the marriage of the very favorable post-Cold War power position of the US and the liberal strain in US foreign policy. It's a unipolar moment, plus the tradition, if you want to call it Wilsonian liberalism, that's fine. You marry these two things together, and you're basically got the energy behind this strategy. Throw into it a little bit of bureaucratic or organizational politics model, which I think is encapsulated in the jokey term, I think invented by someone in the Obama administration, the blob. We can use the term establishment. We can use the term club. I don't care. There's a high degree of consensus in the establishment on this strategy, and debates tend to happen around the margins. And the goal is to, create democracy, improve international institutions, expand international trade, but all in the context of keeping the United States #1 and having the Americans at the center of pretty much everything that happens, with fingers on all the important buttons. So it's liberal and it's hegemonic. Now, I want to turn to restraint for a second, and I want to talk about the essence of what I, as a restrainer, believe the United States has to do. I think we have to say that, you look at the cast of characters who are restraint advocates. Broadly speaking, restraint is grounded in the realist approach to international politics. That true is a big tent, right? So it doesn't give you a simple answer, but it does tell you sort of the way people think. So for me, there's 3 problems. 1, vigilance to ensure against the rise of a hegemon in Eurasia for the usual reasons. You don't want that much power in the hands of one state. Second, I think you have to adjust to the existence of nuclear weapons, and basically, my view is you want to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of states, in the hands of states that can be deterred, and out of the hands of individuals that can't be. So policies that help lock up nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear arms control agreements, informal deals, anything that locks them up. that keeps them safe and secure, that's important for the United States. And third, you have to keep an eye out for these nihilist non-state actors. We've encountered several. To me, this is mainly an intelligence cooperation kind of problem with like-minded countries. I'm leery of the idea that we're going to organize and pacify every corner of the world so we don't have such groups arising. Now, what brings me to this conclusion that really so few things are needed for our strategy? Well, I think liberal hegemony is unnecessary, and I also think it's problematical. So why is it unnecessary? Well, the basic premise, I think, of most people who argue this position is the US is inherently a very secure country. It's rich in terms of industrial and technological capacities and in natural endowments. It has oceans to the left and right, weak and pliant neighbors to the north and south. It's got a huge nuclear weapons capability, which basically means it's unconquerable. We have a great military backed by a talented research and development effort, and a very competent defense industry, although a defense industry that's incapable of doing anything inexpensively. The United States is not very dependent on international trade either, right? So as much as we like trade and people do well out of it, our involvement in international trade is much less than most other countries in the world. Our trade partners are scattered all over to hell and gone. So it would take a whole lot of really bad things to happen in the world to deny the US the ability to trade if you happen to think that trade is important. Now, the problem with liberal hegemony is it violates the first rule of good strategy, which it has no real priorities. And the second is it reaches for one means too often, and that means is force. And this opens the door to high costs of the strategy. And the strategy typically runs into major problems. Some are explained by theories that have been around for a very long time, and others are explained by experience that ought to be hard to deny. So this first problem is this no priority problem. And I think we can see that in the last 20 years, pretty much everything has mattered and still does. Terror, failed states, war crimes, rising powers such as China, revanchist Russia, timorous allies, non-proliferation, it's all on the table, right? And it's very hard to take anything off the table. The US has to spread democracy, further globalization, secure its own advantageous power position, have to be willing to use force. And because the US is a kind of informal empire with a vast periphery, there's always going to be threats or opportunities or disorder just beyond the periphery, and these will be nominated as threats to the entire system, meriting some kind of action, right? So let's remind you about the too much war problem. The United States has been at war, kinetic war, at least twice as often in the post-Cold War world as it was during the Cold War. Different people have counted it at different times. Nuno Montero talks about it a little bit in his book, but Bob Work used to talk about it in a briefing he gave when he was Secretary of the Navy. He had a nice graph that showed this propensity for war. It's not entirely clear why. Some people think it's just because when your only tool, your principal tool is a hammer, that's the one you reach for. I think it's something more deep, it's something deeper than that, but I think that's basically the case. And you can always put another war on the table in the American policy discourse. And some people will recommend 5, 6, 7 different types of military actions at once. And no one ever says to, wait, I mean, you've got a pretty big agenda. May he rest in peace. John McCain never saw a military intervention that he didn't think was a plausible candidate for US action. Now, why is the strategy running into so much trouble? Well, one is because it uses military power. War is a principal means. And it doesn't matter who you read. You can read General Sherman, you can read General Eisenhower, you could read Clausewitz. There's a problem with the inherent nature of war, right? The second problem is the self-interest of other states, including our friends. The third is the diffusion of power, which the National Intelligence Council has talked about. The fourth is the problem of nationalism and other types of identity politics, right? So first, war, right? As I said, Clausewitz, Sherman, Eisenhower, war is a blunt instrument. It's difficult and costly in its application. It's full of unintended consequence. And then we add to this the American obsession with credibility, which is not so surprising for a state that identifies interest for itself everywhere. And therefore, once you undertake a battle, you somehow have to finish. So they're easy to start and they're hard to stop, right? We don't really know how to cut our losses. Second problem is this problem of self-interest. And this is all embedded in realism. And this gives rise to balancing behavior, which is to say that some states are building or rebuilding their military capabilities, throw monkey wrenches in our projects, they concert action with one another, and this all raises our costs. And it's probably going to raise our costs even more. Again, under the rubric of self-interest, there's a moral hazard problem with US grand strategy. The United States provides a lot of insurance to a lot of people. This causes allies to ride cheaply. Their share of GDP, Japan spends on defense is 1%. Europe's maybe 1.5%. This is not a gigantic effort given the fact that these are the people that are ostensibly so vulnerable that America has to defend them. Other friends and allies of the United States, secure in our embrace, drive recklessly. They do things that are problematical for the US, or they just drive carelessly. They don't stop and think, and then we get to deal with the problems. So that's all under the general heading of the self-interest of other states, more or less embedded in a realist theory. Third, due to globalization and the general, sort of modernization of really global economics and global politics and global society, there's a lot of improvement in others' capabilities. I mentioned the NIC earlier. They use this concept of diffusion of power in several of their, their future documents. All this means that other countries are getting rich. And if you look into the out years, you start to see some clustering of the great powers. It's not the United States might not remain number one. It's just the gap between 1, 2, 3, and 4 is probably narrowing. And in a world where others look after themselves, this is going to mean American action is action in a resistant medium. Similarly, with the diffusion of technological capabilities to countries and groups. I mean, we need an answer as to why the Iraq war cost as much as the Vietnam War did in real dollars. In Vietnam, the bad guys had open bank accounts and credit cards. And in China and Russia, they got lots of stuff from them. That was not true of the people we encountered in Iraq. And something's happening that's making war a lot more problematical for us. You even see it in the gizmos that whoever attacked the Abqaiq oil separation fields and gas oil separation fields, they were pretty clever. And the stuff they attacked with looked like it was built in a hobby shop, but it worked. I mean, it got through Saudi air defenses, right? So diffusion of power is another problem. And then we have to talk about nationalism and other forms of identity politics. The US presence, active in so many places, runs into what I think we just have to say empirically is a resurgence of identity politics worldwide. And the US is an easy target for nationalist politicians because it's here, there, and everywhere, right? In the immediate post-Cold War world, where the Americans and NATO went into Bosnia and Kosovo, nationalism was this atavism we were going to extirpate. Well, it turned out that it was more like kudzu. It spread everywhere, even unto our own country. And you can, theorists try and, they spend a lot of time thinking about nationalism as connection to conflict. There's a lot of disagreement about that. But one thing is true. You go into a society that's socially mobilized, where people have an identity and they're aware of it, especially if that society is also undergoing a population explosion, has lots of males in the age between 18 and 25, you've walked into a hornet's nest, right? And the costs are going to be very, very high because mobilized nationalism, they basically resist outsiders who try and tell them how to live, right? So my point is the US is entering a new period, right? We're going to see more consequential powers abroad, more politically mobilizing capable armed groups of every kind, and less political consensus on US foreign and security policy at home. And this is where I just want to say before I close, and I'll close in a second, a couple things about the two big developments we're here. The reason we're sitting in this medium rather than around some table there at SAIS is the Corona COVID pandemic. Now, it's a cottage industry to speculate on what this means for everyone, but it seems to me one of the things it means is that the experience demonstrates that people actually need a state that works. And running against the state in the future is not necessarily going to be a winning strategy for politicians. The huge initial spending is evidence that the state can find lots of money when it wants to, and not just for overseas contingency operations to support war, but for problems at home. It's not going to be easy to tell the American people that they should have a lean welfare and a rich warfare state. And I'm defining welfare state in the most benevolent sense, right? And it's not easy to convince them that resources that could go to fixing this society should go to fixing other societies. right? So this is, I think, going to be an enduring, these are going to be, I think, enduring political facts. And we have to also accept that this is going to grow the size of the national debt. And if at some point we decide that that's a problem and it needs to be reduced, everybody's going to be bill payer. It's not just going to be the welfare state. It's not going to be just entitlements. It's going to be the security effort. So I think we have to accept that. The second thing I think we have to think about is the apparent change in the salience of racial equality in politics as an issue in this country. If this mobilized consciousness persists, can it support a lot of US troops abroad, occupying, fighting, and killing people of color or people of very different cultural backgrounds? I think this is a question that really needs to be asked. Is this going to be a winning strategy for politicians who want to get elected? So against this backdrop of the problems I think that are persistent with the strategy, the diffusion of power in the world, the intensification of identity politics, the long-term consequences of fighting COVID, I don't think incremental adjustment is going to be sufficient to address these problems. I think we just need to play a much tougher game, and Restraint gives you a conceptual framework for how to play that tougher game. Thanks for indulging me as I went over time.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. Mike, why don't you go ahead and lay out your case, please?
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. Thank you, Hal, for the invitation, and Johns Hopkins. And of course, it is an honor, a pleasure to be here with Barry Posen, whose work has been so influential in our field, as Hal has said. And this argument about restraint is an incredibly important debate right now at a time of increasing turbulence. I think Barry and I agree in world politics. And as he said, I broadly agree with the emphasis on limits and avoiding excesses in foreign policy. But I think we can accomplish that without the more dramatic steps that are really reflected in this restraint agenda. Because if restraint as a point of view is about something, I think it's about something bold, as Barry was implying at the end, a very significant and essential change to the fundamental US position in the world. If it's just about ending endless wars and stopping nation building, I think most people agree on that. And the times the United States has been forced into that have largely been agreed to be mistakes. So it has to be something about more fundamental. And that's the question, is whether that argument is justified. And I don't think that it is. So in these few minutes, I'm just going to talk about three things. Areas where I agree with Dr. Posen and the broader restraint agenda. Places where I think the diagnosis of the restraint camp are mistaken, and places where I disagree with its prescriptions. I want to say, by the way, that in terms of if we're measuring prominence of issues, if the US-led world order got 14,000 hits, and that's a sign of how significant it is, while Dr. Posen was talking, I Googled Barry Posen and got 873,000 hits. So that's an indication both of his significance and of the fact that if there's a threatening, concept out there, he has a bigger measure than the U.S.-led world order.
I think they're confusing me with my second cousin, Zach.
Zach, who must be famous for some other reason. So let's start with areas of agreement. Now, as Dr. Posen implied, I'm a little uneasy taking up a position so critical of restraint because I strongly believe in the basic message of limits in foreign policy. I have opposed nation building and counterinsurgency doctrine. I've opposed the military option for North Korea and Iran. I've characterized the war on terror as wasteful and excessive. I've argued against the Afghan surge. I've suggested cutting nuclear forces to minimal level and been part of a process of developing ideas for long-term nuclear disarmament. I've argued for the fundamental insolvency of the current US general global posture, and much more. Now, this collection of views, my good friend Hal Brands may find this to be a horrific catalog of appeasement, but they align with half or more of the recommendations of restrainer. I think limits are really important, but I also believe strongly in American leadership. I believe that American security is linked to global security, despite the oceans and despite the existence of nuclear weapons. Conflicts abroad do tend to come back to us, and there are threats abroad that I think engagement gives us a good way of dealing with. I believe US foreign policy has largely succeeded since 1945, not failed, which is an essential argument of many restrainers. I believe alliances serve US interests, and that a streamlined but still very significant US global military posture is very much in our interest. So all that places me very much at odds, I think, with the ultimate core of the restraint conception. So let me turn, having outlined some areas of agreement and sense that we both, I think, agree on the importance of limits to some degree, some issues I have with the restraint diagnosis. So its critique of current national security policy. Now, Dr. Posen is himself a unique type of restrainer. His work is very careful and nuanced. It is not subject to some of the more extreme claims that you find in some of the other areas. So not everything I'm about to say applies to his book, his work per se, but these are characteristic points of the broader restraint community, so we can talk about them. Basically, my problem is I think that restraint offers a caricature of what US foreign policy really is. The idea that it is always on the lookout for new places to invade, conquer, new wars to fight, I think just doesn't reflect the reality of US foreign policy. Now, for one thing, a lot of restrainers believe that that foreign policy is dominated and warped by a narrow-minded, selfish, often militaristic crowd of national security elites, the blob. That elite supports US global posture, some restrainers argue, because we get benefits from it, because we get jobs and we get invitations to conferences. And a lot of restrainers argue that that elite marches mostly in lockstep, that it is a unified group supporting US global interventionism. Now, having been around this alleged cabal for 3 decades, I just don't think that is the case. I think national security professionals have a broad spectrum of views, and it's much more common to have severe and intense debates on these kinds of issues like the Afghan war, nuclear arms control, the size of the defense budget, than it is to have sort of intense groupthink. Now, to be sure, the national security field does have its shared truisms, its widely held assumptions. If you urge an end to US alliances, that's going to get you labeled at a minimum as an iconoclast. But that's the same in most professions, I think. It's not evidence of any kind of secret cabal or agreement, but the tendency of human beings and groups to cluster around conventional wisdoms. There's still a lot of room for debate on a lot of elements of US global engagement, even despite this. I also don't agree with the restrainer's view that US foreign policy since 1945, and particularly since 1989, has failed, that it has been this sort of catastrophic, costly, wasteful, counterproductive effort, spending hundreds of billions we didn't need to spend and fighting wars we didn't need to fight. I think the evidence to me is very much in the other direction. The prevalence of peace in a lot of major regions of the world, the explosion of wealth, which has been made possible at least partly from the global trade system that US power has undergirded, the rise of democracy around the world, which is encouraged and sometimes protected by US power, this powerfully institutionalized post-war order that is, again, partly a function of US power, partly related to the defending capabilities of US military power, and that has created the potential for a more rule-based international system. So measured not against some ideal standard, but the messy reality of real history and the history of great powers, I think the post-1945 or post-89 record of US foreign policy, even with all of its warts, is pretty good. I also disagree, and this gets to a lot of the comments Barry was making, that US foreign policy is, as he puts it in his book, irredeemably activist, and that it promotes this notion of liberal hegemony. I think that it's a partly selective reading of the evidence that I see. The United States wasn't engaged in unrestrained liberal value promotion when it supported the Shah's Iran or Allende's Chile. It wasn't engaged in that kind of value promotion when it turned a blind eye to death squads in Central America, or when it covered up human rights abuses in Indonesia. I think the US determination to intervene around the world to support liberal values is highly selective. We have often refused to intervene in places like Rwanda, Sudan, Timor, more often than we have chosen to do so. And when we did intervene, obviously, if you read the record of the US debates in the Bush and then Clinton administration about the Balkans in the 90s, the United States got dragged kicking and screaming into that contingency rather than enthusiastically leaping into it. And the more recent wars that restrainers, I think, tend to focus on, Afghanistan and Iraq, are, of course, overreactions, I would agree, but overreactions to the most devastating attack on the United States in modern history. And that's a very different origin story, I think, from the one that some of the restraint analysis tells, which is about this US urge to go around the world and control everything. Now, there's an argument about the expense of this US global posture, the idea that it rules out other kinds of investments and attending to other problems. Well, today we spend about 3.2% of GDP on defense. And that is about the lowest it has been in the post-war period. During the World War II, it was over 35% of GDP. In Korea, 11%, 8% during Vietnam, 6% during the Reagan buildup. As recently as 2010, we spent 4.5% of GDP on defense, and it is projected to continue to decline as a proportion of national spending to 2.8 or 2.9% within another decade. So I myself have made the argument that fiscal pressures are going to squeeze the defense budget much harder in coming years, but even I have to admit that 2.8% of GDP on defense, I think, is pretty much sustainable indefinitely. And I don't see, one big difference is, I don't see defense spending as the real barrier to solving our other problems. I agree entirely that we need significant domestic reforms and investments in social justice, in climate change, in infrastructure, in R&D. But as I see it, that is a $1 to $2 trillion a year problem that cutting 80 or $100 billion from the defense budget is just not going to solve. I think we could probably agree on certain cuts that would still allow us to perform our missions. But the defense budget is not the thing standing in the way of solving our domestic problems. There are other issues that we have to solve, and we can largely solve those problems, or not solve them, but make significant progress without major cuts in the defense budget. And finally, I disagree with the idea that US foreign policy makes enemies, the idea that we're always on the lookout for enemies and that our actions are excessive and create enemies where they don't need to exist. I think NATO enlargement went too far, to be sure, but NATO actions are not the whole explanation for Russia's current hostility. Russia's natural suspicion and Putin's conspiratorial mindset, other things played a role. The United States didn't make Iran and North Korea into the kinds of states that they are. US policy is reacting to the threats of predatory states that threaten their neighbors and trying to deal with those things. But there's a complicated history in both cases, I know, and there's a very nuanced story to be told. But fundamentally, it's not US foreign policy that made North Korea have the ambition of retaking South Korea. I think US foreign policy actually doesn't go around looking for enemies. Most cases, when I start to look at them, this restraint argument to me tends to fall apart. If you look at the history of the US intervention in Vietnam, ultimately Lyndon Johnson hated the idea that he had to throw US power there. He was initially extraordinarily skeptical about using US forces. He came after a decade of Eisenhower and Kennedy trying their best to wriggle around and find any way not to get involved in this war, despite the fact that at times our allies were begging us to. So I think a lot of the specific cases show that the United States is a reluctant intervener in most of these cases, and it's security threats where the United States is provoked that cause the problem. Okay, so finally, the third part of my argument, my disagreement with the prescription of restraint, what it wants to do, that is this phased reduction of US commitments around the world, including alliances. One question that I ask myself is, if in the unlikely event, China were to attack Japan, North Korea were to attack South Korea, Russia were to attack the Baltics, could the United States stand aloof? Would we stand aside? Or would we, as we did in 1950 and 1990, look around and say, wow, we had hoped not to have to do this, but now that a state has invaded this kind of a democracy, we have to help in the defense. Now, if you believe that it is both advisable strategically and morally for the United States to help defend these countries, and that it is practically likely that we would have to do so, then you can't possibly agree with abrogating US alliances. Because if we conclude that we would defend these countries, then backing off and creating doubt about whether we would do that is an irresponsible move. I think most of these alliances are relatively low cost. Certainly there's a certain amount of cheap riding that goes on. But these alliances are helping the United States to deter conflict. The horrifically expensive prospect of conflict in these regions are not causing it. Now, another aspect of the prescription that I have an issue with is with China. And here again, I don't know that Barry and I disagree all that much. I personally think we're exaggerating the China threat a little bit right now, but Beijing's intentions are relatively clear to create a Sinocentric order in the region in which countries are basically forced into economic and military submission to China's dictates, where US trade and freedom of action are shackled, US alliances go away, freedom of expression is curtailed as much as China wants. That's a very bad future. And I think in his book, Barry recognizes, admits, agrees that if China becomes dangerous, the United States has to balance it. But here's the problem. I think if we are going to do that, and as the Chinese threat grows, we can't abrogate our alliances because that would annihilate US credibility in this competition. We can't withdraw US forces because it would undercut the US ability to counterbalance Chinese power. We will have to invest significant amounts in military engagement, in economic statecraft, other tools to compete with China. So restraint doesn't really apply to the Indo-Pacific. And if it doesn't apply there, the most demanding and expensive area of US strategy, I'm not sure how far you get with certain restraint steps in other areas. So what's the solution? I think the answer is pretty simple. As Barry was implying at the beginning, I'm halfway into the restraint camp. I think we should have more discrimination, more limits, but changes that stop well short of this restraint vision of actually moving toward the gradual abrogation of US alliances and pulling back, essentially abandoning most US posture throughout the world. Barry writes in a phrase that I love and use all the time, a grand strategy is a nation's theory about how to produce security for itself. And I think in the 21st century, a time of intense interconnections, and by the way, I see the problem of the pandemic as just reinforcing the need for significant US international engagement to address problems that will come home to our shores, even if we don't want them to. I think that America's theory of how to provide security for itself has to be intensely global and multilateral. And I think where the restrainers go wrong is assuming that a strongly engaged US posture has to be one out of control, has to be one where we are meddling everywhere, has to be one where we push democracy on countries that don't want it. And I just don't think that's the case. So I think we can agree on a lot of steps, no more nation building, no more counterinsurgency, don't make the competition with China into a more zero sum than it has to be. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not abrogate alliances that have kept us out of wars rather than got them in. Let's not shatter global expectations about US power at this critical transitional moment, because the world is entering a period of intense uncertainty. And I think US power, including US military power, when exercised in a restrained way, provides a critical ballast to the international system in ways that it would be very dangerous to cut back on so radically.
Great, thank you, Mike, and thanks to both of you for laying out your positions so pithily. So I'm going to ask a couple questions of both Barry and Mike at this point, and if folks who are watching have questions that they'd like to pose, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. So Barry, let me start with you, if I could, and I'm going to ask a multi-part question, so feel free to take as much time as you'd like in answering this. So one, maybe you could address Mike's contention that, sort of the Occam's razor explanation for why US grand strategy has persisted over 80 years is that it's actually been pretty effective. And so there have been mistakes. There were mistakes during the Cold War, the mistakes since the Cold War. But by and large, the United States, through its forward-leaning, engaged posture, has created a remarkably peaceful, prosperous, and democratic world. So could you take that on? And then the second thing I wonder, could you say a little bit more about your view of operationalizing restraint? Like, what does it look like, say, in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia? And how in getting there do you avoid the problem of destabilization that Mike talked about at the end of his presentation? How do you avoid the perception that you're simply pulling the supports out from under this world order? So if you wouldn't mind, why don't you take a crack at those?
Well, as you know, the book is about post-Cold War US grand strategy and the need for a change after the Cold War ended. The book's not about the Cold War, right? I think US grand strategy in the Cold War was pretty effective, but also very costly, prone to blunders, produced two entirely avoidable wars, a war with China and a war in Vietnam, produced a nuclear arms race that we actually should be quite rueful about the nuclear weapons that we built, not ourselves, and the number that we had when the Cold War ended. These were risk assumptions that were far beyond even what was required in terms of fighting the Soviet Union, right? So there were lots of mistakes in the Cold War, right? But I stipulate that especially after World War II, containing the Soviet Union made perfect sense. And to me, this is what the Cold War was about, right? We have this retrospective view of the Cold War that it was itself some sort of a liberal project. Alliances, free trade, all these things were means to an end. And the end was the containment of the Soviet Union, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was reasonable for us to rethink what our security problems were. Now, I took you through the American security situation. It's pretty good, right? So you take the Russians out of the picture, right, as a major threat, and you look at the American security situation, you have to ask serious questions about what came after, right? Now, you know, you can sort of, I'm not even going to say the glass is half full, glass is half empty. One could simply observe, well, there hasn't been a humongous catastrophe, security catastrophe, right? But then it goes, what is your definition? We have, in my, you know, in the post-World War II period, we have three very costly, entirely avoidable wars. Two occurred during the Cold War, and the last one occurred in the post-Cold War world. Iraq is not a trivial matter. It's a major, major screw up, right? And it wasn't dictated by the attacks of 9/11. The Afghanistan and the mistakes that came thereafter, and you can basically tell a story that says, okay, mistakes get made. This is a different order, right? If you look at, I mean, if you basically stand back and say, what was promised by the optimists, right, about you know, America's, the consequences of America's post-World War II policy? We were going to produce Europe whole and free. Happened? No. We were going to do something significant about nuclear arms race. Well, we lowered the numbers, but the competition goes on apace, and we're getting ready to accelerate it again. We were going to bring Russia and China into some new world order. Oops, that didn't work out well. Then these other little wars on the periphery. So to me, what jumps out at me is the serious cost of our actions in the past, in the past 30 years against against what necessity, right? If you want to tell me that there was a necessity to be active driven by the Soviet Union, I'll say, okay, I accept the necessity, and then you can say that mistakes happen. But I don't see the great motive necessity, right, after the Cold War ended. So I count these mistakes as pretty significant mistakes, right? And I don't think it can be demonstrated that somehow international trade would have stopped, right, had the United States, as my friend and mentor Harvey Sapolsky used to say at the end of the Cold War, had we had a parade and brought the troops home, do we really think that all the international trade in the world would stop? I don't think so, right? I don't think the argument can be sustained, right? So that's, that's my take on part A. On part B, operationalizing. I would be happy, I mean, if Mike and I can have a discussion here, right? Given that I stipulate that preventing the rise of a hegemon in Eurasia is a reasonable thing to do, this does not vitiate the advantages to be gained by giving up some of our activities in other places, right? Now, I think, as I said in the book, I think Europe is, it was true in 2014, it was true in 2010. As ugly as the situation is now, it's still true. If there's a place to try restraint and there's a place to get some real dividends from it, it's Europe, right? And the one, thing that's missing from, I think, Mike's discussion, and discussion, I think, of many who advocate the present strategy, is it assumes that other states won't do anything to look out for themselves if they're put in a position where they have to look out for themselves, right? Moreover, I think it's actually inimical to America's interests to infantilize our allies the way we do and incentivize them not to step up. Any defense that needs to happen for Poland or Germany or Japan is more efficiently done, is readier, is more omnipresent if it's done by the people who live there. And we have, despite our rhetoric, had very little success in energizing our allies to do more. And I only know one way to get them to do more, and that's to credibly commit to doing less. Now, the question becomes, well, you're going to get up tomorrow morning and tell the Europeans you're leaving? No, I talk about this in the book, right? You have to have strategies to implement the strategy, right? So you have to take 4, 5, 8, 10 years to renegotiate treaties, to give people a chance to step up. But you have to, at the same time, be doing things that make your plan to change the strategy credible, right? So when Mike says and others say, well, we need allies, I actually kind of say that, I like allies too. I just don't feel like we actually have allies. I think what we have is security dependencies, right? And what we would like to have is allies. And I think Restraint knows how to get allies. And I don't think the present strategy really knows how to get allies, doesn't know how to turn our partners into allies, right? So in Europe, I think there's a lot of changes we could make. And I've, in any venue, I'd say, look, I can give you a little, I can give you more, I can give you a lot, right? But the first thing I would do was have a European SACEUR, right? And that's been, even Henry Kissinger talked about that. That idea's been out there for a long time, right? I have a European SACEUR, right? I would actually stop having a US ambassador solely to NATO. I would dual hat the US ambassador to the European Union and NATO so that the Europeans know that all the other elements of national power that we keep talking about wanting to mobilize, but somehow don't really have a way to do except by somehow trying to get NATO into businesses it's not going to be in, right? We have to start engaging with Europe's collective power, right? I think we should start getting more, we should have a plan to get American ground forces and tactical air forces out of Europe. They should be leaving, right? If we have a role in NATO, our imminent initial military role should be in the naval area, right? Where we, by virtue of the way I talk about American military strategy under Restraint, America should have naval power, and naval power can play in a very important role, right? So that's the kind of change I would make in Europe. And at least I basically, I want to get out, right? The only thing I even think is plausibly a problem in the Middle East is that one state conquered all the rest. I don't think it's in the cards. Right? I don't even think the Iranians have these ambitions. I don't think it can be demonstrated they have these ambitions. Right? So this leaves Asia, and Asia's the problem. And I confess, I have not crafted the appropriate restraint-ish strategy for dealing with the rise of China. Right? In fact, I've avoided it because I'm not a China expert. I'm not an Asia expert. I don't wish to become one. But I think there are some principles that should govern, right? And the principles are, one, no more hub and spoke, right? It should be a real coalition. Two, it should be a real coalition in terms of the contributions of others, right? Which is to say, we should be talking to our partners in a way that says, look, right? We can't provide the kind of assistance you want if you're not doing what it takes to deal with the initial problem, right? And if you're not doing what it takes to deal with the initial problem, why should we be sticking our necks out on your behalf? Right? I think we have to tell the Chinese there are ways that this can go very badly off the rails, right? Mike talks about in his book how great our strategy has been for non-proliferation. I think in some ways it's been too great. I think the Chinese take it to the bank that they're not going to have a nuclear opponent in their own region. I think we should let them know that we're not going to sit around, right, shouldering a huge burden so that we can have to be in a nuclear arms race with China, which the Japanese can sit out. I think the Chinese should know this could go badly wrong, right? So the game is to start getting others in the game, to start sharing responsibilities, to start sharing burdens, and not by just saying it, not by just saying pretty please, but making it a core element of our policies.
All right, thanks, Barry. So Mike, let me pose 1.5 questions to you, and then we have a number of questions in the queue, so we'll get to those. So this may seem a little unfair, but I'm struggling to reconcile the Mike Mazzar who critiques Restraint with the Mike Mazzar who wrote a book about the invasion of Iraq, which argued that, the liberal impulse and sort of an overactive sensitivity to threat, a lot of the things that Barry talked about played an important role getting the United States into that conflict. And I wonder, so the argument that somebody like Barry might make is that, Iraq and Libya, to take another one, are not incidental to America's global role. They are direct byproducts of that role. And while I might not share that view, there are plenty of people who do. And so how would you respond to that Iraq's and Libya's are just the kind of things that happen when you play this sort of expansive global role? And so the only way to avoid it is to pull back. And then the 1.5 question is, I think you're right that the United States can afford 2.8% of GDP on defense forever, but what if we actually need to spend a significantly higher amount on defense to meet the challenge, say, that China poses in the Western Pacific? Can we still do this as the threats get more severe and as we have to deal with soft security threats like COVID and so on and so forth? Is the mission still feasible?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first, just quickly. I think it's a very important problem. And I think the answer, which is a very simple and ambiguous concept to solve a big problem, is we are going to need much more innovative operational concepts and more advanced technologies that go with them to be able to do these jobs more efficiently. Building up, and obviously there's a lot of work going on in the U.S. services right now, as you know, that are moving in this direction, but just, doubling the size of the Navy is not something we're gonna be able to do. And so the question is, okay, if we've got, this or that mission, I think one thing, a separate debate, which would be a really interesting debate to have, is the Taiwan problem. I see as almost unique in this case. The Baltics, I think the deterrent job in the Baltics is not actually that tremendously difficult. And I think, as Barry is saying, if we're working with others to deter or potentially fight in areas further afield from China, I think that's something that we can do with current and even smaller defense budgets. Committing to a long-term process of recapturing predominance in the Taiwan Strait is, I think, unaffordable for us. So it's a huge cost imposing thing. But by the same token, part of the argument, it's interesting, and I take very much Barry's point from his initial comments about the problematic role of the United States in different areas of the world and how our policy affects people of different backgrounds, people of color abroad. The other side of that coin is that if there's, not necessarily that Taiwan fits into that, comment, but just in general, the places where the United States is pledged to try to make a positive difference, to the extent that we abandon them, we aren't doing people throughout the world any favors either. But so anyway, I think that it's a question of operational concepts and finding ways to do these missions more efficiently, and I think that's possible. On your first question, yeah, obviously in the book on Iraq, I have some quotes that sound very similar to stuff out of the Restraint. In fact, quote some members of the Restraint community talking about this American impulse to spreading its values. But what I found in looking at that case and having a lot of conversations with people about the origins of that war is that alone would never have been enough for the United States to invade Iraq. That it takes some kind of provocation, some kind of event that creates an urgent imperative to act. And that kind of puts into motion not only the American impulse for kind of liberal value promotion, but also the kind of American sense of being willing to exercise violence on a very large scale in a way that some countries are just not willing to do. So I think that it has to have both of those things together. And that's why my argument is when you see both of those, you do see some American overreactions. And what's, I think, interesting is that it is not just a reaction among the national security elite committed to liberal hegemony. It's a reaction of the country as a whole. And so Congress voted to endorse the Iraq War. The American people, by polling, of course, they were being somewhat misinformed about certain things, but they supported the Iraq War. So it is a national problem that leadership has to address. But I don't think it's not a default setting, is my argument. And there's just too many examples of cases where the possibility to intervene was presented to US administration and the reaction was horror, right? We do not want to do that. We don't want to get involved. And so I don't see it as a general truth about American foreign policy.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience at this point. I'm going to start with one from Elliot Seckler, which is, Elliot is one of the leaders of the AHS chapter at Johns Hopkins, so he helped us put this event together. And it's directed to you, Barry. And so the question is essentially this: does restraint as a grand strategy merely trade short-term benefits for longer-term costs? And so if Mike is right that there are certain irreducible interests the United States has in Eastern Europe or East Asia, and we pull back and then things fall apart and we have to go back in, isn't that more costly than it would be to simply maintain the balance with presence and forward deployments in the first place? Or is that an unfair critique of the restraint position?
Well, this is a fairly fairly common argument, but there's several points I would make. One is this notion that you will inevitably go back. I don't think it's a valid notion. You go back to places where the threat is great. You don't go back to places where the threat is not great, right? Are we in danger that Russia's going to overrun Western Europe and become a hegemon again? Is that the danger here? Are the Europeans incapable of buying sufficient insurance to make this, extremely unlikely, right? So if it was a great gamble in a place where we would be there, for example, we wouldn't have let the Russians unify Germany by the sword, right, during the Cold War. We wouldn't have let them do that because we thought we understood where that went, right? You could say, well, why would you leave Germany? You're going to go back anyway. And I say, no, you're probably right, right? But I'm not going to say that about Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I'm sorry. I'm not going to say it about Poland. And I don't accept it as an argument, right? So if it were true, yeah. So if you want to turn the argument on its head and say there are some things in Asia where you would definitely, go back, so you can't simply, it's pointless to simply leave, and that would be right, right? You want to present a deterrent posture, especially, right, if there's some giant disparity between the problem and the stakes. And of course, at the aftermath of World War II, there was a big disparity between what was left of Soviet power, even after all the costs they paid in the war, and what was left of German and French power after all the costs they paid, which was nothing. So we stepped in to defend a true power vacuum against the big bear, and it made perfect sense, right? So I think this argument comes rather trippingly off the tongue, but I think the argument has to be applied selectively. There are places where, yes, that argument is plausible. There are other places where it's not plausible. There's also questions of, risk and cost, right? Okay, there is some risk that if we leave Europe and the war breaks out and it doesn't go the way we want, that we're going to come back. And it may be that having left, we will have raised the cost of war, right? Maybe, possibly, could be, probably, possibly, right? The probabilities and the costs don't sufficiently come into alignment to make me think, well, we really have to stay there sitting on the place, when it's just transparently obvious that the locals can defend themselves. You could say, well, they won't. Well, that's a different argument. Now we're getting into essentialist argument about the nature of particular societies and cultures, right? And you're making an essentialist argument that the Russians are inherently aggressive, and that the French and the Germans and the rest of the Europeans are inherently capitulationists. And I don't buy it.
Okay, the next question I think is directed to Mike, and it is from Chris Preble of the Atlantic Council. Hi, Chris. And so Chris asks, if 3% of GDP is an appropriate level for Americans to spend on defense against Russia or China, what is a reasonable level for other countries to spend, given that they are more proximate to Russia and China and far more directly threatened by them? Related, is it reasonable for Americans to wonder whether some of the money spent on a far-flung military apparatus might have been better spent at home?
So it's reasonable to wonder that, and I think that some of the amount of money that we spend on our defense apparatus could be redirected to home. Like I say, to me, we have a much bigger question about the home front, and that is, I think, we have some very big questions to ask about the proportion of national wealth that we are devoting to the solution of domestic problems, of climate and other things. And those are questions that are way beyond whether we cut $50 or $100 billion from the defense budget. So that's why I see that as not But on the argument of cheap riding and shouldn't others pay more, I mean, again, Taiwan, this is a big question. Taiwan spends significantly less of its GDP on defense than the United States, and it is right under the Chinese gun. So that's an issue. More broadly, though, as everybody knows, it's a complicated issue because the United States is committed to these places, not because they spend enough on defense, because they're worthy of our commitment. We're committed to them because of our interests. And we have an interest in avoiding, and I think we agree on this, hegemonic control of major regions by another, particularly a hostile power. And that has been an essential element of US foreign policy for at least 70 years and really longer. So once we have that interest, then yes, we are sometimes in a bind as the world leader and as the most powerful state, where others will look at us and say, if I can be part of NATO, I don't need to spend 3% of my GDP on defense. And we will get into free riding and cheap riding, and that will go on. To me, that doesn't change the fundamental question of whether our interests are at stake. And when I look at Europe, for example, and we can debate how much more we can get the Europeans to spend just by arguing about it. And we're running that experiment now, and it does not seem to be a whole lot. I also, though, believe that the claim that pulling away will get states, particularly in Asia, to spend more, to enter into a much more determined local confrontation with China is an assertion, it's an experiment we would run, the outcome of which could be very dangerous for the United States. So the idea that there's a immediate causal relationship between retrenchment and others doing more, I think is debatable. But more than that, like for example, if you look at Europe, we've gone from over 300,000 US troops in Europe to about 25,000 and coming down. It could come down a little bit more. We get some support funding from European allies that mean that it is, all sorts of different estimates of whether it's more expensive to have troops abroad or at home, but it's kind of a marginal difference. If the risk of war is actually low, then the risk of having those troops there is also low. And ultimately, to me, it comes down to, are we going to still have a commitment to their security? I think the United States has decided that the free and independent status and security of the core of Europe and key countries in Asia is an American vital national interest, and that that commitment will exist at some level. And that's why I come back to the idea that, if you leave, will you go back again? I agree with Barry that it may be that we don't have to. But if it ever became necessary to do so, if Russia did mess with the Baltics in a way that got it into a war with NATO, I think we would end up going back. So to me, the restraint argument ultimately gets down to this really fundamental question that has to be answered. Is the United States going to break its commitment to defend these countries? If it does, I think that unleashes all kinds of stuff in the international system that could be very dangerous for the United States. And I think it doesn't reflect the truth about our vital interests. If we are not going to fundamentally break that, if we're going to have a new SACEUR and pull back the troops, but leave the commitment in place, then we come back to this idea that I think we're running a very dangerous experiment. Why should we do that if their security is really important to us? That's the fundamental question we have to decide. And if somebody wants to make a strong case that it's not, that the Chinese utter domination of Asia really doesn't make any difference in the United States, we can have that debate. But there's not many people that go that far. So that's why I think a lot of the restraint agenda ultimately ends up being sort of a halfway solution that runs a lot of risks without actually disengaging the United States from a security commitment to much of the world.
So another question has come in, this one from James Colligan, a master's student at SAIS, and it's directed at both of you. So maybe I could ask both of you to take a relatively brief crack at this. Why don't, Mike, you can start, and then we'll go to Barry. What do both panelists make of the Trump administration's foreign policy? Where does it fit on the restraint activist spectrum?
So my personal view is that we kind of have the worst of all worlds right now, which is, like I was just saying, we have not abrogated our commitment to major allies. We are not talking about, there's hints occasionally, but then US officials always come back and say, no, Article 5 is still strong. We're still committed to Korea's defense. We're committed to Japan's defense, right? So we are making a lot of public statements and taking some actions around the edges that perhaps call into question how seriously we mean our promises, but we are not actually getting rid of those promises. And so to me, there's some inconsistency there, and it's dangerous because if somebody reads that as not really being serious, then they might challenge a commitment.
What about you, Barry?
Well, I'll do that thing that academics do. Well, I wrote about this. I have an article in Foreign Affairs called Illiberal Hegemony, the surprising grand strategy of the Trump administration. Now, I think it's holding up reasonably well. I think the Trump administration has all of the we're large and in charge instincts, and none of the inclination to use that large and in charge for anything other than becoming larger and more in charger, right? I mean, that's their basic thing. And they will sometimes adopt the rhetoric of leader of the free world, or we're going to save democracy here. But mainly they're committed to power and to getting material gains, right? So the Trump administration doesn't care who it deals with, if in the end they can show money in the Treasury or money spent in the United States or a better deal for American workers or whatever it is, right? It's a very neo-mercantilist approach to economics, and it's a very kind of our way or the highway approach to security. And Trump has been rather careful about where he uses military power. He really likes to use it in places where it's almost inconceivable that there could be a response, with the exception of killing Soleimani, which was sort of a deviation from that. And I'm actually fearful that they're still they're going to run more risks with Iran. So I think they have a very strong hegemonic impulse. They're quite, bellicist, right? They believe in the big stick. He loves military spending, even if he doesn't like general officers. It's not a strategy that I conceived of, but it's not a strategy that others conceived of. So when Donald Trump was elected president, it was, oh, you finally have a restrainer in the White House. I said, I don't think so, right? And I think that's right. He was not a restrainer in the White House. Now, one other thing I would say about President Trump, and I think it's a weird kind of evidence of the blob hypothesis, and that is the president almost can't find anyone to staff the bureaucracy who will work his will, right? He finds SecDefs and under SecDefs and all kinds of other folk, and they turn out all to be liberal hegemony people, and so they don't criticize the allies very heavily. They don't throw their weight around. I mean, he can't get people to implement his policies, right? And that's, to me, this is simply an interesting fact, right? And I think it tells you something about what the establishment believes, the degree of consensus.
So speaking of the Trump administration, we have not one but two questions from John Bolton. Although
John Bolton is here. Wow.
I'm fairly certain it's not that John
really
Bolton.
John Bolton.
John Bolton, who's a PhD student at SAIS. But it'd be more fun if it were the John Bolton. So there's one for each of you. And so, Mike, the question for you is, if new concepts can enhance operational effectiveness within budget constraints, isn't that an argument for at least marginal retrenchment? So that's for you, Mike. And then Barry, the question for you is, I think the political question of how do you frame restraint, not as isolationism or appeasement or whatever pejorative you want to attach to it, but as a more judicious use of national power. So Mike, why don't you go first, and then Barry.
So yeah, no, I don't think it's an argument for restraint. I mean, the kind of things I have in mind, and obviously we don't have time to go into this in depth, but I mean, a lot of the emerging technologies that have been talked about in terms of unmanned systems, the greater use of information capabilities in war, the application of AI for some command and control things, swarming systems, distributed firepower, all kinds of things that are being developed, I think have the potential to be brought together into a capability to build on what's already happening, which is a significant decline in the capacity for long-range power projection. That's ultimately good for us. I mean, I think we like to project power into places, but what we're trying to do mainly right now is keep others from doing so. And an interesting sort of agreement, that I would have with Barry is, a lot of those technologies are low enough tech that we can go to our allies and you know, do co-development and kind of encourage them to say, look, this is a way that you can become much more of a porcupine, become much more self-sufficient in your own defense. Even, you know, for not a significant amount of additional spending. I do think that we should move in that direction to really encourage it, partly on the idea that, you know, we're not necessarily coming to rescue you, that the Americans are not going to execute their plan to bring 300,000 people here in 2 weeks. It's just not going to happen. So, but I don't see that. I think that all can be ways, and admittedly, these are prospective concepts and technologies. But I think those are ways to better accomplish existing missions, not to retrench. They would be more of a retrenchment argument, I think, if you could execute all of that strictly from the continental United States, and you could say, hey, we can pull out from everywhere, and we've got magical weapons that allow us to defeat aggression. But that's, you know, most of the stuff has to be in the theater.
What about you, Barry?
Well, the critique or the caricature of restraint as isolationist doesn't come from us. It comes from people who basically want to marginalize our arguments, right? The advocates of restraint are basically realists. And I laid out my version of what threats are and when you need to act and when you don't. Now, if there's a problem with labeling, there are certain things that as a restraint person I want to do, and these would normally be considered to be good things and multilateral things. And you can say that I want to share responsibility, and to share responsibility means to share decision making. I want to enhance the resilience of the entire system. To enhance the resilience of the system means its individual units need to be more capable of looking after themselves. You don't want to be in a position where you can have you have single point failure modes, right? One of the problems that the British had trying to sustain their world position with too short a bankroll in the late 1930s was that they couldn't. So once they were well and truly engaged, in Europe, they were not in a position to do anything really to deter Japan. Right. So resilience is another thing that comes out of, I think, this strategy. You want to energize others, right? Somewhere, I can't, I mean, don't give them a fish, teach them to fish. I mean, those are the kinds of, sort of positive words and positive concepts that you can kind of, wrap around this strategy, because I think that's the MO, right? This is, read the last chapter of Hans Morgenthal's Politics Among Nations about what is diplomacy, by which he really means what is grand strategy, right? And look at what Morgenthau, the high priest of realism, is recommending, and then look at what Restraint is talking about and scratch your head and call it isolationist. It doesn't wash. It's an unfair characterization.
So we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to roll about 3 questions into one for this last bit, and I'll ask both of you to address it. And so the question itself is a mix of questions that Alec Ferris raised, but it's also a nod to my colleague and friend Frank Gavin, who has been trolling me with text messages throughout this event. And the question goes like this: is there a downside to encouraging significantly more military spending among our allies and partners in Asia and Europe? Do US military deployments around the world, although costly, provide the dual benefit of constraining our adversaries while restraining certain allies? And if I could add on to that a little bit, I would say, Barry, and I suppose this is directed mostly to you, you start, one of your premises is that keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of additional actors is a good thing. If restraint leads, not just Japan, but say Germany and Poland to feel like they need nuclear weapons for their defense, how does that weigh in the costs and benefits of a restraint strategy? So Barry, why don't you start, and then we'll let Mike have the last word.
No, there's no downside risk to encouraging increased defense spending among our allies. We encouraged increased defense spending during the competition with the Soviet Union. And people forget, because they want to, that Germany had essentially the mightiest military in Europe at the end of the Cold War, with the exception of the Soviet Union, on continental Europe, the continental European landmass. This is an army that mobilized to 1 million, mostly men, in 96 hours. They had 5,000 battle tanks that put, who knows how many combat units, aside from the dozen odd divisions they admitted to. There were another, I don't know, in the German territorial army, there were another, I don't know, 27 brigades or something like that everyone just didn't understand. They staffed up the entire NATO rear. They mobilized 100,000 items of civilian equipment. I mean, this was a huge mobilizable war machine. It just never got mobilized. Thank goodness, right? Maybe the Russians were scared of it, and that was our intent. But I didn't see other people in Europe going around in a panic about this, right? So I'm not really that concerned about it, especially given that, in here, it was, should I as a realist be concerned that countries on one side of Europe will be more afraid of each other than they are of the Russians? I think the Russians are energetic enough to scare them into hanging together rather than hanging apart. The area is very heavily institutionalized, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a potential problem in Asia? There could be a potential problem with Japan, but I don't think it's that much of a problem. In other words, moving the Japanese from 1% of GDP to 1.5% of GDP spent on defense would do a lot, especially if spent the way Mike suggests, because you don't need fancy new concepts or anything else, right? Anti-access area denial, this is just nothing more than typical coastal defense thinking updated for modern technology, right? If the Japanese spent another 0.5% of GDP on this, all the Chinese can complain about is they've made it harder for them to be aggressive in the end, right? So I'm not very worried about it, right? Now on the nuclear side, I'd like to be very careful here. I'm interested in best practices that keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of non-state actors. I think state actors can be deterred. I actually more or less buy the nuclear revolution hypothesis. I know that's not popular these days, but I do, right? So I think that if we in the end have a choice between going through all of the gymnastics that we went through to make extended nuclear deterrence seem credible, filling forces up with tactical nuclear weapons under lousy control, giving keys to allies, building counterforce capabilities, chasing the other guy's submarine force around, using conventional forces to actually force the pace of escalation. Right? All the things we did in the Cold War to make essentially the incredible credible, that we would sacrifice my town, Boston, for Bonn, which was not a very pretty city anyway, right? To make that credible, right? If the choice is to do that or have Japan have a second strike capability, I think it's at least debatable which outcome we want. So for me, nuclear nonproliferation is not an ideology. It's a policy that either does or does not serve the interests of the United States. And it's not evident to me that it serves the interests of the United States in that case, or if it serves them now, that it will serve them forever.
All right, Mike, what do you say?
So yeah, I mean, I agree with the spirit of the question. I think there is a tremendous danger. I think this really comes down to, and it's a good concluding question, because I think it comes down to sort of a fundamental difference of thinking about the issue of, should the United States use its power to go out into the world and proactively shape world politics in ways that ultimately, and this is why I like Barry's definition of grand strategy, because creating security for itself is what the United States has been doing, in part by helping to shape this world. I think that, realist theory has helped educate me about the natural tendency of the international system to spin out of control. And if we propose to create a situation in Asia, for example, where a dozen countries are put in a position of believing that they now have to increase their defense budgets by 50 or 100% to defend themselves against China, you're triggering an arms race that is going to be very dangerous, I think, almost no matter what comes out of it. And dangerous in part because, as we know, there are still imperfect relations among US allies and between countries like Japan and others in the region that are going to create tensions as they mutually respond to China. So I just feel like there's so much evidence that for a limited amount of expenditure, for a limited amount of risk of getting involved in war, U.S. power has played a critical role as being one of the things that has helped to stabilize at least two of the dominant regions in the world order. And withdrawing from that does not lead to some, I think, easily stable new world where everybody builds up a little bit more and China says, okay, they can all defend themselves now. It leads potentially to a world of arms racing, of appeasing China in some cases, of new tensions among US friends and allies, of potential nuclear proliferation, which I agree with more or less the nuclear revolution point, but still, it's always been worried that the significant spread across additional numbers of countries is going to call that into question. So anyway, this just unleashes a lot of dangers that I see no need to unleash. When the US role in these regions is not the thing that is risking war for us imminently, it's not the thing that is breaking the bank. It is something that the United States can do to shape the international community and provide security for itself in ways that I think have been a great success and are sustainable.
Well, it's the mark of a good conversation that we have questions that we don't have time to answer, both on my part and on the part of some of the people in attendance. And so since we're over time, I'll just conclude by thanking everybody for turning out for this. Thank you to the Alexander Hamilton Society for helping put this on. And most of all, thanks to Dr. Posen and Dr. Mazzar for giving us a very rich discussion of American grand strategy. So it's my pleasure to have you here, and I'm very glad you could come.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure for me.
Likewise.